Song for a Whale, Chapter 12. Mr. Gunner smiled and waved when I carried the Zenith into the shop. I set it on the counter and waited while he rang up a customer buying a creepy old doll. "It really works?" he said after the customer left. Mr. Gunner used to have such a bushy mustache that talking to him was like trying to lip read a walrus. He kept it trimmed now, so I didn't hang over his upper lip anymore. I nodded and invited him to check it out. Sometimes the radios needed a little more adjusting after I thought I was finished. I knew when a radio was working, but couldn't always tell if the sound was clear enough. Some static was too faint for me to feel crackling against the speakers. Mr. Gunner's smile let me know I got it right. He shook his head and laughed. Then he looked at me so I could see his mouth. To make things clear, he threw in a few signs he'd learned from me. "I admit, I wasn't sure you could fix this one." He tied a price tag to the cord, then handed me the radio. After putting it on a shelf, I wandered around the store to see if there was anything I needed. Mr. Gunner gave me an employee discount, even though I wasn't an official employee. That store was where I first got interested in electronics. Grandpa and I would pick up things like old lamps and toys, take them home to work on them together. Sometimes we'd take parts from different lamps and make a whole new one, like the bottle lamp I made for Grandma. Then I started not just fixing things, but making things. I built an alarm clock that shook my mattress in the morning, all with parts I picked up at Moe's. I made an alarm clock for Tristan, too. He could hear just fine, but he was such a deep sleeper, nothing could wake him. At first, I gave him an alarm clock I'd connected to a truck horn. It did wake him up, but it also woke my parents, who said they nearly had heart attacks when it went off. I made him another one out of an old toy police car that drove around his room blaring its siren until he got up to turn it off. One day, when Grandma and Grandpa were shopping for furniture, I discovered the radios. I pushed buttons and turned knobs, trying to figure out how they worked. Mr. Gunner took the time to explain what he could, pointing at radio parts and jotting down notes on some scrap paper. Even better, he gave me a broken old radio to take home to work on. After he handed it to me and saw how excited I was, he held up a hand like he had to warn me of something. "It'll be a challenge," he wrote. Well, that did it. I didn't know whether he meant that it'd be a challenge for anyone to repair that radio or for me because I wouldn't hear when it started working. Either way, I was taking it home. Lately, I've been feeling like I could fix anything. I was ready for a challenge. He added to the note, "The best way to learn how something works is to take it apart and put it back together." I didn't know what made him think I was smart enough to do that, but he did. It took a lot of work, and I almost gave up a few times, but eventually I did get that radio fixed. More importantly, it taught me how radios worked. I'd lost count of how many I'd repaired since then. I would have missed out on all of that if I hadn't been there with my grandparents that day. Without that store and Mr. Gunner, I wouldn't know I was good at anything. After shelving the Zenith, I didn't find anything I needed, so I went back to the front counter empty-handed. As Mr. Gunner wrote out the check for my repair payment, something in the display case caught my eye. I held up a hand to stop him, then tapped the glass over the item. He smiled and pulled a giant key ring from his pocket so he could unlock the case, then looked at me to see if he was removing the right thing. I held out my hand and placed the gold circle on my palm. It looked like an old pocket watch. Etched into the cover was an ocean scene with a whale leaping out of the water next to a sailing ship. With a fingertip, I traced the black outline of the whale. Mr. Gunner reached over and unlatched the cover, revealing not a watch, but a compass. "Still works," he signed. "A compass? Even better than a watch." I closed the cover and ran my finger over the etching again, wondering about who it had belonged to. A ship captain, I guessed, because of the design. Before computers and GPS, people navigated with compasses and the stars in the sky. Finding that whale compass felt like a good sign. Like maybe it'd bring me good luck in figuring out a way to talk to Blue 55. I held it up to let Mr. Gunner know to subtract the price from what he owed me. "Something different," he said, then signed the check. "Ready to sell me that Philco?" he asked before I left. He didn't need to sign or write that down because he asked that every time. He was sort of teasing. Sure, he'd love to have the Philco back, but he also knew I'd never part with it.